Tommy Bennett ruled Glasgow's streets with an iron fist. But it was his own brother Craig, and a shadowy businessman named Malcolm Fraser, who dealt the fatal blow that shattered the city's deadliest gang war forever. For over a decade, Glasgow was a city held hostage. Behind the historic buildings and vibrant culture, a darker reality unfolded on its streets. Two criminal empires, the Bennett brothers and the McGraw firm, carved up the city like a map of war. It wasn't about territory anymore. It was about power, pride, and survival. Entire neighborhoods became battlegrounds, where fear wasn't just a feeling, it was a way of life. Families locked their doors by dusk, business owners paid protection money without question, and the police, mostly powerless, often outgunned, and sometimes quietly complicit. The Bennett brothers ran the East End like kings, led by the eldest, Tommy Bennett. The trio was notorious for their ruthlessness. Steven handled the drugs, Craig kept the soldiers in line, and Tommy, he was the strategist. He stayed in the shadows, rarely seen but always felt. Their influence was total, their reputation unmatched. Violence was their currency, and they spent it freely. Anyone who crossed them ended up in hospital, or worse. Witnesses vanished, cases fell apart, and juries were too afraid to convict. Across the Clyde, the McGraw firm dominated the South Side with a different approach. While just as dangerous, the McGraws styled themselves as businessmen. They wore suits instead of tracksuits, and instead of turf wars, they preferred takeovers, buying out operations or pressuring rivals to switch sides. But don't mistake polish for softness. When the McGraws needed to send a message, it was swift and brutal. Their enforcers were clean, efficient, and silent, and they knew how to make someone disappear without leaving a trace. For years the two gangs maintained a fragile balance, each respected the other's power, and a loose understanding kept them from all-out war. But like all uneasy truces, it was only a matter of time before something broke, and when it did, the violence exploded. A pub bombing in Parkhead, a warehouse torched in Govan, a body found in the canal, wrapped in chains. Each move was answered with another. Blood was currency now, traded back and forth between two empires. Families of gang members were targeted, girlfriends attacked, younger recruits pulled into the madness with promises of money and status, only to end up dead before their 20th birthday. Glasgow's streets became unpredictable. In some areas gangs operated more visibly than police. People lived in fear of being caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. A takeaway shop in the crossfire, a nightclub raid gone wrong, a school run interrupted by gunfire. Local newspapers called it a crisis. Politicians made promises, but no one could stop it. Not really. What made it all worse was the silence. The code, no one talked. If you did, you were marked. The threat didn't need to be spoken. Everyone already knew, and so the cycle continued, retaliation after retaliation, each act darker than the last. Glasgow wasn't just a city with a crime problem. It had become a war zone disguised as a metropolis. Through it all, the Bennett brothers held firm, their empire growing. The McGraw firm adapted, their reach spreading into legal businesses. But beneath the surface, both were preparing for something bigger, a final move, a decisive blow, and when it finally came, it wasn't in the form of a full-blown war. It was a single clean hit, delivered with precision, backed by betrayal, and set in motion by a force no one had expected. Tommy Bennett wasn't just a gang leader, he was an institution in Glasgow's underworld. From a young age, he understood one simple truth: fear lasts longer than respect. While other street-level tough guys came and went, Tommy climbed the ladder with cold precision. He didn't seek fame. He didn't chase chaos. He built his empire with silence, paranoia and control. By the time he was 30, he'd already outlived most of his enemies. His name alone could empty a room or shut a witness's mouth. In the criminal world, he was considered untouchable. Unlike many gang bosses who craved the spotlight, Tommy made it a rule to stay invisible. He rarely used a phone, he changed cars constantly, never slept in the same flat more than 2 nights in a row, and didn't show his face at public events. His movements were unpredictable, and his inner circle was small. Even those closest to him didn't always know where he'd be next. He operated like a ghost, using fear and uncertainty as his armor. Every decision, Every step was calculated for maximum control and minimum exposure. He wasn't flashy either, no gold chains or loud designer clothes. Tommy dressed plainly, drove modest cars, and never posted anything that could draw attention. But those who underestimated him learned quickly that his quiet nature masked a deep ruthlessness. He could be charming when needed, but behind that calm exterior was someone capable of extreme violence. Stories circulated about the things he'd done, how he once buried a rival alive, how he made a man choose between losing a hand or an eye. Whether the stories were true didn't matter, the legend did the work for him. Tommy's rise to power wasn't just about brutality, it was about discipline. He ran the Bennett operation like a business. His brothers managed the ground-level activities, Steven overseeing the drug supply lines and Craig keeping soldiers in check. But the big decisions, the long-term planning, that was Tommy's realm. He had connections not just in the streets, but in shipping yards, warehouses and even real estate. He laundered money through shell companies and nightclubs. He made deals with corrupt officials. Everything was structured to keep him insulated. Even the police couldn't get to him. Surveillance failed. Undercover efforts led nowhere. Every time they got close, the case would fall apart. Witnesses refused to testify or disappeared. Evidence was lost. There were rumors of bribed officers, of backroom deals, of entire files vanishing overnight. Detectives came and went, but none could make charges stick. Over time, many in law enforcement began to believe he was simply too big to bring down. Other gangs feared him, but not just for his violence. It was the way he thought ahead. Tommy never reacted emotionally. He waited, planned and struck only when the odds were perfect. That's what made him so dangerous. You never saw it coming. He never left loose ends. No shouting, no warnings, just silence, and then action. But with power came enemies. Tommy knew that better than anyone. He didn't trust easily, not even his own family. Paranoia kept him alive. He built walls around himself, mental, physical, and strategic. But eventually one of those walls cracked, and when it did, all the planning in the world wouldn't save him. Because the deadliest threats don't come from across the street, they come from within. The fragile peace between the Bennett brothers and the McGraw firm couldn't last forever. Both gangs had grown too large, too bold, and too greedy to share the city much longer. Tensions that had simmered quietly for years finally boiled over in 2018 when a shipment of high-grade cocaine vanished from the docks. Both sides blamed each other. The Bennetts accused the McGraws of hijacking it. The McGraws claimed it was an inside job. Whatever the truth, it didn't matter. The balance had tipped, and with it came blood. The first major strike came when a McGraw lieutenant, Alan Hodge, was shot outside his home in Castlemill. It wasn't just a hit, it was a statement. Broad daylight, no mask, and 3 bullets to the chest. The shooter walked away calmly, knowing full well no one would speak to the police. Alan had been a rising star in the McGraw firm, a quiet enforcer who kept business running smoothly. His death was personal and professional, and it ignited something uncontrollable. 3 weeks later, the Bennetts were hit back. Steven Bennett, Tommy's younger brother and the logistics man behind their drug operation, was cornered in a pub toilet in Dennis. CCTV footage showed him entering alone. Minutes later 2 men followed. No one came out for nearly 10 minutes. When they did, Steven was on the floor, stabbed multiple times. He was rushed to hospital, but died before surgery could begin. The message was clear. No one was safe, not even blood. From that point on, Glasgow's underworld went into freefall. Pubs once used as neutral meeting points were torched. Safe houses were raided. Associates on both sides began turning up dead or vanishing completely. The violence crept into public view more often. Street chases, car bombs and shootings near schools. Locals were caught in the chaos. Stray bullets hit innocent bystanders. One teenager was paralyzed by a bullet meant for a dealer. The city was gripped by fear again, just like the early police presence increased, but it didn't stop the carnage. Both gangs adapted. They changed methods, used younger, unknown faces for hits, and communicated through dead drops instead of phones. Violence became smarter, but not less brutal. One McGraw courier was found tied to a lamppost, his hands cut off. A Bennett enforcer was buried alive in a shallow grave near Pollock Park. only found after anonymous coordinates were sent to a newspaper. Each act was more savage than the last, as if cruelty itself had become the scoreboard. The media dubbed it Glasgow's silent war. No trials, no confessions, just bodies and blood. People were too afraid to talk, and the gangs too smart to leave evidence. Police could only guess who was winning, and even within the criminal world, no one really knew how far the feud would go. Some whispered that Tommy had become more unstable since Steven's death. Others claimed the McGraws were bringing in outside help, Serbian contractors, or ex-soldiers turned hitmen. Everyone had a theory, no one had answers, but underneath the bloodshed, something else was taking shape. Unnoticed by most, a new layer of the conflict was unfolding. Quiet meetings, unusual alliances, and strange movements that didn't fit the pattern. A shift was happening, one that had little to do with old grudges or territory, and soon it would change the war forever. It was an ordinary Wednesday morning in Finnieston, one of Glasgow's busiest districts. Commuters sipped coffee, workers rushed to offices, and the air was filled with the usual city noise. No one expected violence, no one expected history to change, but at 8:40, a single act of precision tore through the routine, a hit that would stop Glasgow in its tracks. Tommy Bennett, the city's most feared gangster, was gunned down in broad daylight. 3 shots to the chest. No words, no warning, just cold, deliberate execution. He had arrived quietly at the cafe that morning, likely thinking it was a routine meeting or perhaps just a rare moment of calm. Surveillance cameras showed him stepping out of a dark SUV, dressed casually, phone in hand. He looked relaxed, almost unaware of the danger around him. Less than 60 seconds later, 2 men on a stolen black motorbike pulled up behind him. One got off, walked straight toward Tommy, and opened fire. 3 controlled shots. Tommy dropped instantly. The gunman returned to the bike, and they disappeared into traffic like ghosts. The entire hit took under 30 seconds. Within minutes, police sealed off the area. Witnesses were too shocked to react. Some thought it was a film shoot, others simply froze. The CCTV footage went viral in underground circles almost immediately. The city's underworld buzzed with disbelief. Tommy Bennett, the untouchable, the ghost, was gone. No warning, no build-up, just silence, then death. For those who knew him, the manner of his killing felt wrong, too clean, too professional. It wasn't the McGraw's usual style, it felt bigger, more deliberate. The Bennett crew reacted with confusion rather than fury. No immediate retaliation came, no fiery threats, just silence. Tommy's younger brother Craig vanished the same day. Some believed he had gone underground, preparing for revenge. Others whispered darker possibilities, that he had known what was coming. The McGraw firm for their part remained eerily quiet. No celebration, no gloating. They issued no statements to allies. If they had ordered the hit, they weren't showing it. Detectives were baffled. They had spent years trying to pin charges on Tommy. Now he was gone, and instead of closure, they were faced with more questions. Who ordered the hit? Who carried it out? And why did it feel so different from every other gang-related killing they had investigated? There were no shell casings left behind. The bullets were custom-made. The motorbike was torched within an hour, found abandoned near an industrial park with no fingerprints. The gun was never recovered. This wasn't just another killing in a brutal war. It felt like the final act of something deeper, something planned not just to eliminate Tommy, but to make a statement, a message, not to the streets, but to those watching from higher ground, those with power, money and plans that stretched beyond gang rivalry. And while the meeting, they issued no statements to allies. If they had ordered the hit, they weren't showing it. Detectives were baffled. They had spent years trying to pin charges on Tommy. Now he was gone, and instead of closure, they were faced with more questions. Who ordered the hit? Who carried it out? And why did it feel so different from every other gang-related killing they had investigated? There were no shell casings left behind. The bullets were custom-made. The motorbike was torched within an hour, found abandoned near an industrial park with no fingerprints. The gun was never recovered. This wasn't just another killing in a brutal war. It felt like the final act of something deeper, something planned not just to eliminate Tommy, but to make a statement, a message, not to the streets, but to those watching from higher ground, those with power, money and plans that stretched beyond gang rivalry. And while the media treated it as the climax of the Bennett-McGraw feud, those paying closer attention sensed something else, a shift, a redirection of power. Because in Glasgow's underworld, death is rarely the end. Sometimes it's only the beginning. The hours and days after Tommy Bennett's murder were filled with a strange, uneasy quiet. Glasgow, a city used to the sound of sirens and the ripple effect of gang retaliation, waited for the next blow, but nothing came. No car bombs, no drive-by shooting, no bold declarations from the Bennett crew. The city held its breath, expecting blood, but instead, there was silence, and that silence was louder than any gunshot. Craig Bennett, the last surviving brother, had disappeared completely. Normally he would have stepped up, rallied the troops, and led a campaign of revenge. That was the pattern everyone expected, but Craig's phone was off. His known hideouts were empty. No one in the criminal world had seen him. Police put out quiet surveillance notices, hoping he might surface at a funeral or secret meeting, but there was nothing. It was as if Craig had vanished from the face of the earth. The Bennett crew, once tightly controlled under Tommy's command, began to fall apart without leadership. Some lieutenants started looking out for themselves, distancing from the name that once commanded loyalty. Others jumped ship entirely, offering their services to smaller gangs or rival operations. With no orders and no direction, the empire Tommy had built over decades started crumbling almost overnight. It wasn't just a loss of leadership, it was a total collapse of identity. The McGraw firm's reaction was even more puzzling. Instead of seizing the moment to crush their longtime rivals, they remained quiet. No expansion into Bennett territory, no sweeping arrests of rival dealers. Instead, they reinforced their own borders and kept operations low-key. Detectives monitoring the gang expected movement, expected celebration or at least some visible change. But what they saw instead was restraint. It didn't make sense. This wasn't how gang wars worked, unless something else was going on. Among detectives, that sense of confusion turned into suspicion. They had chased Tommy for years, and now that he was dead, the absence of fallout didn't sit right. An internal report flagged the hit as unusual in nature, citing the execution's precision and the post-murder inactivity. The word professional kept coming up, meaning it might have been ordered by someone outside the gangland ecosystem, someone with bigger motives than vengeance. The public had their own theories, news outlets ran endless stories. Pundits speculated that Tommy was killed by a rogue faction within his own crew. Others suggested the McGraws had hired foreign hitmen. A few even floated the idea that police or intelligence agencies had quietly removed him to avoid further bloodshed. But while everyone argued about who did it, the more important question lingered unanswered. Why was everything suddenly so quiet? Underneath the calm surface, those closest to the streets whispered of a power vacuum, of meetings in quiet pubs, new faces in old places, and sudden offers of employment from names no one recognized. It was clear something was moving in the shadows, something smarter, colder and more organized than either the Bennetts or the McGraws. Tommy's death hadn't just ended a rivalry, it had created space, and in Glasgow's underworld, power never stays vacant for long. 2 months after Tommy Bennett's assassination, the investigation had stalled. Police had no suspects, no confirmed motive, and no credible witnesses. The public had moved on, but detectives hadn't. Something about the hit still felt off, too smooth, too quiet, too effective. The forensic evidence led nowhere, and the usual sources in Glasgow's criminal circles weren't talking. But then, almost by accident, a crack appeared. A small-time enforcer named Declan Boyd was arrested during a routine traffic stop. Inside his car, police found a stash of Class A drugs, a burner phone and a silenced pistol. On its own, the arrest wasn't remarkable, but Declan had ties to both the Bennetts and the McGraw firm, a rarity in a city where loyalty was usually non-negotiable. Detectives flagged him as a person of interest and applied pressure. Within 72 hours, Boyd broke. He didn't give up the name of Tommy's killer. He didn't even know who pulled the trigger, but what he did reveal changed the shape of the investigation entirely. Boyd claimed that in the weeks leading up to Tommy's murder, a senior Bennett associate had begun secretly passing information to someone outside the crew, meeting in dark car parks, exchanging briefcases and USB sticks. It wasn't a one-off betrayal, it was systematic, calculated, and ongoing. The name he gave shocked the task force. Paul Donnelly, a high-ranking member of the Bennett inner circle, a man Tommy trusted for more than a decade. Donnelly had no criminal record,
kept a low profile, and was often seen as the brains behind logistics. He wasn't flashy or violent, but he knew where everything was: money, weapons, safe houses, drop points. If anyone could take down Tommy from within, it was him. As detectives followed this new lead, they found something even stranger. Donnelly's phone records showed regular contact with a number registered to a shell company. That company in turn was linked to a portfolio of properties owned by a man named Malcolm Fraser. On the surface, Fraser was a legitimate businessman, real estate developer, construction investor, occasional donor to local charities, but whispers had followed him for years. Too many business deals with convicted criminals, too much money moving through too many accounts. Fraser had never appeared on police radars as a suspect. He was careful, clean and well connected, but suddenly, his name was showing up in the background of Glasgow's criminal collapse. Detectives began to piece together a different theory. What if Tommy's murder wasn't ordered by the McGraws at all? What if it was orchestrated by someone above the gangs, someone who saw Tommy not as a rival but as a risk to a larger operation? The pieces began to fit. A trusted insider turning on his boss, communications running through corporate fronts, a businessman with silent influence over both sides of the gang war. It wasn't about drugs or territory anymore, it was about control. The war between the Bennetts and the McGraws may have been real, but Tommy's death had a different signature. It wasn't emotional, it was strategic, and the person behind it wasn't playing the street game, he was playing something far bigger. As detectives dug deeper into Malcolm Fraser's background, a far more complex network began to emerge. On the surface, Fraser was everything he appeared to be: clean suits, high-rise offices, and a reputation for transforming derelict buildings into sleek new development. But behind the polished image was a hidden layer of influence that stretched across Glasgow's underworld. What began as whispers of involvement turned into a trail of connections, each one linking Fraser not just to known criminals but to major decisions that had shaped the city's power structure for years. Fraser had never been involved in direct violence. That wasn't his style. Instead, he brokered silence. He offered protection, funding and opportunity, quietly absorbing gang leaders into his growing empire under the promise of safety and stability. Those who agreed found themselves elevated. Their operations were streamlined, laundered, and embedded into legitimate fronts like construction firms, import businesses, and private security. Those who resisted often faced sudden setbacks, raids, betrayals and in some cases, sudden disappearances. Nothing could be traced back to Fraser. That was the brilliance of his method. What detectives discovered next stunned even seasoned officers. Fraser had been meeting regularly with members of the McGraw firm for over a year before Tommy Bennett's death, not in back alleys or secret hideouts, but in boardrooms and business lounge meetings listed as consultations or project reviews on corporate schedules. Investigators couldn't pin criminal intent on any of them, but the timing lined up too perfectly. Each meeting seemed to follow a key moment in the gang war: a killing, a shift in control, a silent retreat from contested territory. Even more alarming was Fraser's apparent link to Paul Donnelly, the Bennett insider who'd been feeding him information. Financial records showed that Donnelly had recently acquired a modest stake in a Fraser-owned property firm. The stake was purchased through a third party, but the trail was clear. Donnelly had flipped. He wasn't just passing on information, he had fully aligned himself with Fraser's agenda. The betrayal wasn't emotional or personal, it was business. Fraser's motive became clear as the pieces fell into place. Tommy Bennett, for all his power, was unpredictable. His grip on the city was fueled by fear, not foresight. Fraser, on the other hand, needed order. He needed consistency. He saw the gang war not as a threat to public safety, but as a threat to profits. Construction projects delayed by street violence. Investors nervous about headlines filled with blood. Tommy had become a liability, and liabilities had to be removed. So Fraser did what he always did. He built an alliance in the shadows. He promised the McGraws expansion, freedom from harassment, and a bigger slice of the market, so long as they stayed within his rules. In return, they offered silence. He flipped the necessary people inside the Bennett crew, gathered intel, and waited for the perfect moment. And when Tommy's guard dropped, Fraser made his move. It wasn't revenge, it wasn't Runkunst, it was corporate strategy applied to crime. The gang war didn't end because one side won.
With Craig Bennett's betrayal uncovered, the investigation entered a new and dangerous phase. The once clear lines between enemy and ally blurred, and the city's underworld became a chessboard where pawns and kings were constantly shifting. Detectives now understood that Fraser's influence wasn't limited to the gang war. It extended deep into law enforcement, politics, and business circles. His reach was silent but pervasive, making every move in the investigation fraught with risk. Detectives found themselves working under intense pressure. Internal leaks slowed progress, and confidential informants vanished or turned up dead. It became clear that Fraser had eyes and ears everywhere, including within the police force itself. Officers who questioned too closely found their careers stalled or worse. The investigation had become not just about catching killers, but about dismantling a vast network of corruption that protected Fraser's empire. Meanwhile, the gangs were changing. The McGraw firm, emboldened by Fraser's backing, began consolidating power quietly but firmly. They expanded into areas previously controlled by the Bennetts, but their style was different, less violent, more businesslike. They avoided public clashes, focused on money laundering, and built alliances with smaller criminal groups to maintain control without drawing attention. It was a new kind of gang warfare, one fought in boardrooms and back offices instead of on streets and alleys. Some former Bennett loyalists tried to resist. They formed splinter cells, seeking revenge and attempting to reclaim territory. But without clear leadership and resources, they were no match for the McGraw's coordinated strategy. Within months, most either disappeared, were absorbed into Fraser's network, or fled the city. The old gang war that had terrorized Glasgow for over a decade was effectively over, replaced by a shadow system run by Fraser's silent hand. For the public, the end of the gang war brought relief, but few understood the cost. The streets became safer, yes, but the city's soul was quietly reshaped. Criminal power had shifted from violent turf battles to invisible influence, money laundering, corruption, and control over legitimate businesses. Glasgow's underworld was no longer ruled by fear but by order, and that order was enforced by a man no one had suspected. As the investigation closed in on Fraser's closest associates, prosecutors faced their biggest challenge yet, proving beyond reasonable doubt that Fraser himself had orchestrated the hit and controlled the sprawling network. The evidence was intricate and heavily concealed behind layers of legal business structures. But with persistent surveillance, financial forensics, and whistleblowers from within the criminal ranks, a case slowly built. When Fraser was finally arrested, it wasn't a dramatic raid or a high-speed chase. It was a quiet early morning operation, conducted with the utmost discretion to avoid alerting the many who depended on him. As he was led away in handcuffs, the city's crime world watched in stunned silence. The man who had pulled the strings behind Glasgow's deadliest gang war was finally exposed. But the true test was still to come. Could the justice system dismantle the empire he had built in the shadows? Or would Fraser's influence prove too deep to break? The trial of Malcolm Fraser became one of the most watched legal battles in recent British criminal history. For months, the courtroom was packed with journalists, police officers, former gang members, and ordinary Glaswegians desperate to understand how the city's darkest chapter had ended. The prosecution laid out a detailed case, how Fraser had manipulated two violent gangs, orchestrated Tommy Bennett's assassination, and built a vast criminal network hiding behind legitimate businesses. The defense argued carefully, portraying Fraser as a successful entrepreneur caught in a web of accusations without solid proof. Evidence was complex and often circumstantial. Financial records revealed millions of pounds moving through shell companies, but direct links to violent acts were harder to prove. Witnesses feared for their lives and many refused to testify or retracted statements. The prosecution's challenge was not only to connect Fraser to the crimes, but to convince the jury that this was not just a business rivalry but a cold, calculated dismantling of a violent criminal empire through betrayal and strategy. Inside the courtroom, the human toll of the gang war was impossible to ignore. Families of victims watched as the details of executions, disappearances, and terror were recounted with clinical precision. For many, the trial was not just about justice, but closure. For the police, it was a chance to show that even the most powerful criminals could be brought down with patience and determination. but for Fraser's defenders, it was a battle to preserve a legacy of success and deny any involvement in a world of violence. As the trial progressed, new information emerged that stunned everyone involved. Former associates came forward, offering insider testimony in exchange for reduced sentence. They painted a picture of a man who controlled everything from afar, making deals over dinner tables, ordering hits through proxies, and managing alliances with the precision of a corporate CEO. It was clear that Fraser's empire was built, not on guns, but on influence, fear and silence. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom was packed. The jury took just hours to reach a unanimous decision, guilty on multiple counts, including conspiracy to commit murder, money laundering, and racketeering. Fraser was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The sentence sent shockwaves through Glasgow and beyond. The man who had seemed untouchable was now behind bars, and the city could finally breathe easier. But the story didn't end there. Fraser's empire didn't collapse overnight. Investigations continued into his business holdings and associates, revealing a web that stretched beyond Scotland's borders. New leaders emerged in the underworld, but none matched Fraser's reach or subtlety. The gang war's bloody legacy remained a cautionary tale about power, loyalty, and betrayal. For Glasgow, the hit that ended the war was more than just a violent act. It was a turning point that exposed how crime had evolved, from brutal street battles to shadowy control. The story of Tommy Bennett's death, the silent mastermind behind it, and the quiet takeover that followed, changed the way law enforcement and the public understood organized crime. And while the scars of the past lingered, the city's future looked different, a future shaped by lessons learned in the darkest days of its history.